Okay, welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Spark to Sport. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure to have your microphone on mute. And if you wish to ask any questions, you can do so by pressing the button Show Conversation and type up your question in the dedicated section. So we spoke on a microbiome yesterday with Dr. Orla Sullivan, and if you are not able to attend it, you can access all the talks via the UCC Sports channel on YouTube. So today we are welcoming Dr. Fiona Chambers. Just a little bit of disclaimer before we start. I know Fiona for quite a few years, as she was my PhD academic supervisor, and she had a huge impact on my academic career. Fiona is the head of school of education in UCC, a senior lecturer in PE and sport pedagogy, and an institute certified design thinking coach. She published 14 books and 20 book chapters. She has 2 more edited books due for publication in 2020, and she's part of various international research leadership groups, such as the UNESCO Scientific Committee for Physical Activity, the European Council of Research in Physical Education and Physical Activity, and many, many more. Fiona, welcome to the webinar. When I contacted you a couple of weeks ago about taking part in the webinar, you very kindly accepted, and you mentioned you wanted to talk about developing a superpower in this time of crisis. Personally, I'm quite a big fan of Marvel and DC Comics. So what kind of power are we talking about? I believe, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Apologies, that's a great
better.
Beginning. That's a great beginning.
Much better.
So it's wonderful to have the chance to talk with you guys today about this. And I'm going to actually, I suppose, give a little bit of background. I've been working in this particular innovation space for a long number of years. And with the work that I'm doing globally as Secretary General of ISEP and working with UNESCO and the various organizations, I'm seeing locally and nationally and internationally how important this superpower is that I'm going to talk to you about. So I think maybe I'll get started, if that's okay, and I'll welcome any questions that anybody has. So I'm going to just share my first slide with you, and we're going to get moving then. So I'm just going to go there. So my first slide, I hope everybody can see that, and Jeff can put his thumb up just to say he can see this or not.
It looks great so far. Well, design.
Design. So what I'm saying to everybody today is that design is actually our superpower in a very, very strange environment that we're currently living in. And with that in mind, we basically need to think a little bit differently about how we imagine sport and physical activity in this time of crisis. So what I'm talking about today is something that we are actually doing at the moment in relation to the sport and physical activity issues that are facing us in this global pandemic. And we're developing this idea around a hackathon. So everything I speak to you about today is basically talking about the background to what we're trying to do in this connection, and also a call to action for anybody who's interested in helping us with this initiative. And maybe you'll get an insight into, I suppose, under the bonnet of what all of this type of thing might involve. So we're in a global pandemic, and it's been going on for quite a while now. And I hear the phrase new normal, and I'm actually saying that it's not a new normal. And a colleague of mine recently in a discussion said, actually, it's an entirely new era that we're going into. So sport and physical activity as we know it is no longer going to be there. So we have to reimagine what that might look like. And Peter Senge from MIT said something really interesting. He said that today's problems are often yesterday's solutions. And what he meant by that was essentially the idea to have mega cities, the idea to destroy habitats and bring humans and animals closer together, has meant that viruses have started to mutate, etc. So in other words, it seemed like a fantastic idea at the time in terms of our food supply to make those choices, and also in terms of economics to have that volume of people. But now we can see what's actually happening. So it's an interesting thing to realize that we have to be cognizant of how complex what we're dealing with is. We're seeing a number of headlines in relation to sport and physical activity. Can sport survive without spectators? And that was literally this week in The Economist. Also, this idea that without a vaccine, that people really aren't interested in going back to sport. And really, I suppose, if we were to distill those ideas down, it's that we have this thing that Mogens Kirkby, who's the president of the International Sport and Culture Association, he terms it as this fear versus social hunger, that people really, really are afraid at the moment for their health. And they still really want to be together, to play sport together, to socialize together, and do all of those things. And this is currently something that we have to try and figure out. This is something we need to hack, as it were. And it's not going to be good enough to do your production line answer to this that's going to fit in every single context around the world. So whatever we innovate or we imagine in terms of how sport and physical activity might look, it's not going to be something that's going to fit everything. It's not a cookie cutter model. So we need to do something a wee bit different in that respect. So what we're doing at the moment in living through this crisis is we're building a raft while we're swimming at the same time. So it's an extremely agile, complex situation. Coupled with that, we have a range of different generations all living together, whether it's in the university environment, the community environment, etc. Whatever we design, we have to be cognizant of the builders, and all the way through who were born earlier than 1946, all the way through to the newest children that are out there who are Generation Alpha, and they were born in 2010. So when we talk about innovations that we're trying to develop for communities, we have to think about all of these people. But specifically in University College Cork, we're thinking very definitely of the population that's staff and all of the rest of the people, but our own end user. And that end user is actually Generation Z. Typically, it's Generation Z. So that's really who we're looking at. And that person is somebody, I'm going to introduce you to a persona, because often when we talk about design, we like to have an end user in our head. This person is John. John is Generation Z. He's digital, global, social, mobile, and visual. So this is how he works. And whatever we're going to develop to try and to circumvent the fear he's feeling and to enable him to meet his friends, to engage in sport again, and to be more physically active again, this is what we're going to have to think about in terms of the types of solution that we're going to come up with. When we think of him in terms of Generation Z, you'll see that it's quite interesting in terms of Generation Z in this context, in terms of what they're interested in. So the gadgets that they're actually known by are AirPods. And you'll see that there's basically, when we talk about the workforce of 2030, 34% of them, a third of them are going to be Generation Z. And you can see this is some quite interesting information in terms of really empathizing and being compassionate towards those people we're trying to design for in terms of sport and physical activity. So I suppose the question I have, the design challenge I have, is how could we help John to feel safe and to engage in sport and physical activity in a COVID-19 world? And when I say COVID-19 world, I mean that this is it's not that the virus is here to stay. It will be in some format, I'm sure, but this is utterly changing how we think and feel and do. So therefore we need to think of it in that way, in that context. And when we look at problems, the one that I've just posed you, I wouldn't categorize it as being a simple problem. So simple problems are, if I was to give you, I suppose, an image of what that could look like. A simple problem is something like baking a cake, where you have ingredients and you make the cake. A complicated problem is when you make like a rocket, a space rocket, and you launch it into space. But a complex problem is something like raising a child. So no matter what you've learned in the process of raising a child, there is no way you can lift that and transfer it to the next time you raise a child. So it's an extremely complex situation. So what we're trying to do here fits into the category of complex. And to try and push that across to you, I want to share this slide just in terms of what's needed when you're dealing with these types of issues. So if I'm dealing with something that I'm seeing as simple, I only need some data. If I'm dealing with something that's a little bit more complicated, I'm looking at an algorithm and maybe some more data will actually solve the problem. But what I'm saying here is what we're trying to resolve in terms of reimagining sport and physical activity is something really wicked. And when I say wicked, it means that it's constantly moving, fluxing, changing, multiple stakeholders. You fix one thing and another thing pops up. So it's very, very, very difficult to try and, I suppose, come in with a simple solution to whatever you're talking about. So I have just a short video, literally 4 minutes, that I would like you to watch now. And it's trying to explain the complexity of a system. And we are trying to do that when we're reimagining sport and physical activity. It's within a very complex system. And I'm hoping now that this is going to work.
Let's see.
We will see. And I might, I wonder if I'm just going to try this just for a second. And just try it one more time. And just try that one more time. Sorry now. And I'm just going to try that sharing opportunity one more go. Let's see if that's going to work for me. And if it doesn't, there's no difficulty. I'm actually going to get you to watch it in your own time. But it would be nice if you could actually enjoy it. No, it doesn't seem to for some reason. And
otherwise, you can email me the link, and I can put it onto the YouTube channel.
So what I'll just explain very briefly, this particular video is set in Yellowstone Park, where they introduced wolves back into Yellowstone Park. And as a result of the habitat changing and the food chain changing, it changed the behavior of the rivers within that actual park. And it's quite astonishing to imagine how reintroduction of a population of animals could have such a systemic change in terms of that particular environment. Why I want you to watch it is to show you how complex these types of challenges are. Now, keeping that in mind, we believe that in order to innovate and to develop solutions to any of these highly complex problems, we have to spend a long time looking at the problem and then developing solutions. And often I think humans tend to, when they're faced with an issue, they immediately jump to, oh, I'll just do this or I'll just do that. But often they're not taking account of the complexity of what they're trying to deal with. And what we say to them in terms of design and design thinking is that we have to spend 80% on the problem and 20% on the solution. So we have to spend a long, long portion of time trying to figure out what are the issues at hand in terms of the complexity of the problem we're trying to resolve. And therefore, then we start spending some time in the solutions. So we don't waste time jumping straight into solutions that may or may not work. To do that, we have to have a very interesting mindset. So design thinking requires a mindset which is quite curious. And these dimensions of curiosity were developed by Merck, that corporation, in the last couple of years. And they did a study that it basically went across America, Germany, and China. And it looked at populations and what were the dimensions of curiosity in those populations. And you will see that people who are quite optimistic and open in these times of crisis are the ones that are really, really going to make the difference. So it's this idea where you're open to stakeholders, multiple stakeholders' ideas, that you're also really okay with anxiety or confusion or distress that arise as you're going through that innovation journey, that you're really excited about exploring new opportunities and new options, and you're really excited about the joy of learning those. And the really important one here is this idea of recognizing what's the issue, what is the gap in knowledge that's going to actually help us to resolve the issue that we're presenting here, which is really how to reopen sport and physical activity in the world and in Ireland in particular, as it were. So this mindset is vitally important. And Jean Liedtke and colleagues have done a lot of work over the last number of years, and Tim Brown, and there's many, many people in this space. And businesses are using design thinking to try and deal with their day-to-day business, but more importantly now in this current crisis. And this is why I believe that this is the way forward in terms of how we might tackle things. It'll be vitally important in the design thinking process to make sure we have multiple stakeholders, because every single person comes with a different view of the situation. And that's helpful, because in whatever we actually design in the end, it has to meet all of those generations that I spoke about earlier, all of their contexts, etc. So the more people you have involved in the beginning in terms of crowdsourcing your ideas, etc., and defining the problem in a concrete fashion, the more and better solutions that you're going to get that will actually work and have impact. So we follow a design thinking process, which is six different steps. We spend ages, as I said, in the problem space, which is typically from understand, observe, and point of view. And this is a space in which we start to diverge to try and understand the population we're trying to serve. So who are the end users? And in UCC, they will be our student population, observing, empathizing, being compassionate, and then figuring out what is actually the problem here. It may not be what we think it is. And once we've defined a point of view after that amount of time, we start to move into a space where we start to ideate and understand what are the options open to us. And from that, we distill down and choose a number of prototypes that we'd like to test in a fashion with the end users. And we test and evaluate in the final phase of that. When we've done all of that, typically the process moves into a business mode, how to business model what we're up to, how to make sure that it's viable and it's feasible and it's actually going to have impact. Because going through this process is fascinating and interesting and all of those things, but it's not going to be worth anything unless these ideas can be tried and tested. Why do they work? And why does this process work? It works because it relies on the human, and it relies on the human being at the center of not only what the problem is, but also the solution. And in that way, it makes it something that has huge traction and actually works in multiple contexts. Sorry, now I'm just moving this direction. And what we tend to do as well in terms of mixing in and making sure that we understand as I said to you earlier, the complexity of what we're doing. We use the design thinking that I've just spoken about, but we always keep looking to the macro and to the system. So in other words, what we try and do is we integrate systems thinking with design thinking to try and attack what's going on. So we understand the complexity of the system, problem oriented, what is I suppose the optimum state for the system to be in terms of its health as a system. And then we focus on understanding human behavior, becoming very, very solution oriented, and then basically making sure that the thing is highly viable and that can actually work in terms of our population. And when we're actually doing that, we use this particular, I suppose, way of thinking. So we're oscillating between the system perspective and the top line there and the human perspective on the bottom line. So in other words, we're working through exploring the system, mapping the system, creating system narratives, strategizing. And then underneath that, we're making sure that we're passing through all of those human-centered design processes to make sure whatever we deliver is going to be good and will work, and et cetera, et cetera. In terms of work that I've done already on this has been really successful in relation particularly to sport and physical activity. This is a process that we used, and we used it over a number of years, and we're still iterating it, actually. This idea of made to move. And made to move was something which we were trying to address a very complex challenge, which was physical inactivity. And through design thinking and an iterative process, taking account of the system in which this particular problem resided, we came up with a particular intervention which centered on mentoring, trained mentors supporting people to be physically active in their community. So we've proven that it's more than viable to do this particular type of process. We're now really excited to go forth and I've done, I say, about 40 design projects at this point. This particular one resonates with what I'm talking about today, but we really feel ready to get this hackathon on its feet and to actually really crowdsource some of the questions that our stakeholders have and to develop some really nice design challenges for a hackathon and to see, can we do something really different and to reimagine what sport and physical activity might look like in this new era, and to have a much more, I suppose, positive outlook on what might be possible rather than a more deficit model in terms of what's currently happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think,
sorry.
yeah.
If I could,
yeah.
if you allow me to stop you. Couple of months ago, I came across an interview that you gave on Virgin Media on the work that you did on how to tackle homelessness and how to try to resolve that crisis. Would you mind expanding a little bit on your project, and how did you? What really interested me is how you took that project and really rethink the whole thing way through and really approached it with a whole different idea to try to solve that crisis.
Yeah. So first of all, it's and all of us are like this. We hear the news and we hear the issues that really matter in a country. And when you hear the figures, the homelessness figures that were very, very significant in Ireland and elsewhere, it was really a call to action to say, what could we do? So a group of people who are very interested in helping decided to approach an organisation that exists in Cork for many, many years, Penny Dinners, and to actually sit down with the director of Penny Dinners and to ask her, okay, if we were to work with you on this and to help you, this is the expertise we have. Would you be willing to work with us and to talk to us about what's going on? And as we worked with Katrina, we started to discover that when you journey mapped what was going on in that complex system, it actually had nothing to do with houses. What we discovered through the design thinking process that I've described to you now is that in the world of somebody who's homeless, the problem was the 9 hours that they were wandering around on the street where they had nothing to do. So actually the issue was around feeling worthwhile, feeling that you have something to contribute to society. And at the same moment that the homeless person might be learning new skills, etc., with a view to them eventually having a home. So in other words, it was a time in which they could actually add value to their own skill set, and that they might be in a position to actually have a home at the end point. And Katrina has been doing work on this for a while, just on the basis of the conversations that we had with her. And she has actually prototyped that idea, and it is unbelievable. And this is in her own really interesting style. So she has worked with her own team to develop pathways into work and pathways into study for a number of homeless people. And they're now living in a Penny Dinners home, in a house together. And I suppose the intervention point around studying or learning new skills through employment was actually the game changer to them being able to feel empowered and able, and being able to hold, I suppose, hold down a house and to rent that house, etc. So that was an amazing insight in terms of the complexity, but not only the complexity that we assume. And Jeff, in answer to that, we could have gone in when we were working with Penny Dinners, we could have gone in and said, it's houses, we just need to build more houses, we need to find funding for houses. But actually, by stepping back and by really listening to those people who actually work in Penny Dinners and know what's going on in there, we were actually able to find out the real issue.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think the key word in there, as you mentioned, is listening. I think listening could be one of the superpower. I think, nowadays everything is done quite fast, and I think listening and empathy has to be a key attribute and a key skill when you develop a project. And when we are projecting ourselves to September, October, to what's going to be life, with maybe post-virus or in the middle of the virus. And in terms of physical education and PE teachers, hopefully schools will be reopened and life will go back to some kind of normality. But if there's some kind of PE teachers out there listening to us and they're interested of, that design thinking, that opportunity to create something out of a pandemic, out of a very complex situation, and we're able to develop something sustainable that has a sustainable answer, not a flash in the pan. What could it do to learn a bit more and try to slowly develop that process?
So what we do in the degree program in UCC is we're training our student teachers as design thinkers. So they're actually learning how to do this. They learn how to do it, particularly in relation to the Made to Move project. They actually were involved in the iteration and design of that project. So what you try and do is to embed it in a project that matters to them as professionals. So they learn how to do it on something that matters to them, so that they go forward as graduates and can actually do it themselves in their schools. The other place in which we've been educating them in this area is in the area of research, because using design thinking in that process to really design a research project that matters, it's really important. I mean, it's quite astonishing, the research question that somebody would come to if they follow a design thinking process. It may not be the question they initially imagined. And the other part of that, I suppose, is it just ensures, or not ensures, but it tries to ensure that whatever they start to do in research is not just research for your CV, it's research for impact. I mean, we're serving in University College Cork, we are serving the community. Our research is serving that community to make lives better. So therefore, any research, whether it's a student project or otherwise, needs to actually have that stamped all over it. So we are training them, we are educating them in that way of thinking. And it's quite interesting because often they find it difficult to think in that way, to say it's okay to fail, it's okay to get it wrong. So I found it very interesting when we were doing the Made to Move iterations, where each week we'd have data and I'd say, okay, the data is telling us that maybe the pod activities aren't working. What do we do? And they couldn't believe that we might say we're not doing them anymore, or we might gather a bit more data on them, or we might redesign that element. They couldn't believe the bit where you cut away the bit that's not working, you iterate it and you'd move on. They found the bit where failing publicly was very difficult for them, but they got better at it. And it was really a change in mindset for many of my own students anyway, certainly, from that point of view.
You know, when you mentioned the word failure, I think failure is a huge learning curve. And if it's approached with the right mindset, it's a great opportunity to learn and to grow and to rebound. Now, in terms of physical activity, you did mention, you know, physical activities and students and what UCC is doing for the community. At the moment, a lot of school will be, for example, emailing students or families with YouTube video, such as Joe Week. What would be your point of view on that approach? Now, in a way, look, I mean, I know Joe Week is serving a purpose. There's a void was created, which is a pandemic. Nobody can go out. People need to exercise. Kids need to exercise. And suddenly you have someone like Joe Wick, hugely popular on YouTube. I think each video every day has something like 1 million of views, which is absolutely incredible. So what would be, I don't know, what do you think of the whole thing?
What I think is like, and this is very interesting because I set up a kind of a global conversation called ICEP Connect. And our next one is on the 29th of May. I think we'll be running it at 5 p.m. Irish time. But essentially, the first one that we ran was about that topic. It was about, is Joe Wick the new face of physical education? Because initially, when this happened, he I suppose, marketed himself as the new physical education teacher, the national PE teacher. And when he went on, he's so fun. He's very engaging. Children are really, really, you know, enjoy it. But it's not PE. It's fun. It's exercise. It's mimicking, but it's not physical education. So we had a really interesting debate professionally about this across PE and physical education, teacher education. And I suppose we came to the idea that, okay, what he's selling isn't PE, but yeah, it is fun. And yes, there's a spotlight on physical education. The piece missing in terms of what he does is there's no qualitative feedback. So it's just follow what I'm doing. And even adults who are following him seem to be getting injured. So there was a recent article on that in the Wall Street Journal. So it's interesting from that point of view. But if we can harness and learn from what works from, this is the design mindset. You say, what's he doing? That's right. Why is he getting 1 million viewers? If I had 1 million viewers, I'd be delighted with myself. So there's something the man is doing right. He's really good at marketing. He's really good at selling his message. He knows how to package the message in the right way. So if we could learn and say, oh, I like this bit and I like that bit and I like the other bit, and add in our lovely professionalism to that, then we'd be onto something. So it's like innovating what exists already, learning from it. The thing that you don't want to see people doing is completely pushing something like that to one side. There is a reason why it's working. My lovely colleague Louise McQuaig mentioned recently, and we did a podcast, just a conversation around this topic, and basically she said that when there's nobody standing at the microphone, somebody will stand at the microphone. And as it turned out, the gap was there, and Joe Wicks stepped up, and he grabbed the microphone, the PE microphone, and off he's gone. So we can learn a lot from Joe, I would say.
No, I agree. Everything with him, if you look at it, it's very well marketed. You know, it comes up with like Spider-Man suits, and the whole thing is very, you know, interactive in a way. You know, every day he changed a little bit of a setup of his background setup, so kids have to try to find what changes and all that. Yes, a void was created, used it, and now what can we learn from it to bounce back and make the whole thing sustainable in September? We are coming nearly towards the end of this webinar, nearly 30 minutes already. Thank you, Fiona. I will ask you one more question.
Sure.
What if you had a key message to give to people right now? If you had the opportunity to have a huge billboard somewhere in New York, somewhere in Paris, anywhere in the world, if you had to put one message on it, what would it be?
My message to the world. I would say that I think it's the idea that we are all designers, and that the only way we are going to have hope in this crisis is to design our way out of it. And my message is to have hope, we need to design our way out of this crisis. That would be my big message on Times Square. Wow.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I will see you on Monday with Nick Winkelman. He's the head of fitness for the RFU, so hopefully it will be very interesting. Fiona, Dr. Chambers, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye.